Okay, anatomy and physiology. This is not a massively large section, but I really do want to hit in on the basics of what the heart does, what makes it a unique organ, and how that turns in, or how we're able to measure the heart in terms of the electrical output that it creates. And there's a lot that goes into that. So here we go. Very simply put, everyone's got a heart, even the Grinch. But for humans, what we have is it sits right here towards the center of your chest, just a little bit off to the left side, and particularly the left ventricle and apex are off to the left. But if you just make your fist right now, that's about how big your heart is, give or take. It lies obliquely, so it is turned on its side. So it's not really a heart that's shaped like this. It's more of a heart that's shaped like this. It's off at a bit of an angle. It has a 2-layer membrane around the outside of it called the pericardium, tough, fibrous outer part. Now, the layers of the heart itself, it's important to keep a few things in mind. For starters, the fact that it is inside out is the biggest thing to know. What makes it unique is if you think about your arm has skin on the outside, and your muscle is underneath that, and then innermost to that is going to be veins and arteries and nerves. Heart's the opposite. The epicardium, the outer portion, so epidermis, epicardium, the outside, is where actually all of your arteries, your nerves, and your lymphatics, everything's on the outside, and your veins as well. Now, beneath that is your myocardium. Now, the myocardium is particularly important because that's the workhorse of your heart. That's what really does the job. And it's just muscles. Muscle cells, myocardium, because myo means muscle. Lastly, to the innermost portion of the heart is going to be your endocardium. And the endocardium is made mostly of connective tissue. It's really just cartilage. Now, what makes it really cool is that the cartilage that lines the inside of your heart is continuous with the arteries and veins that it's connected to, so it has one smooth surface. Another factor that makes the endocardium really unique is how tough and fibrous it is. You know, you think about the cartilage in your ear or in your nose, it can withstand a fair amount of wear and tear and abuse, and so that's what allows it to beat for 90 or 100 years without really needing any repair to the innermost layer of it. This question hopefully won't be too tough. Which layer of the heart is responsible for the strength of contraction, also known as the workhorse of the heart? Well, just break these down real quick. The endocardium is that inner lining, and that's mostly cartilage. The myocardium is the muscle layer. The epicardium is the outer layer, and that's where your arteries and nerves and things are at. And then, of course, the sinus node is part of the electrical conduction system. So based on all that, it makes perfect sense that the myocardium is the answer. So let's review the chambers of the heart really quick. Important things to know about the heart is it has a top and a bottom half. And so when I refer to top, I talk about the atria because they're at the top, they're towards your head, and the ventricles are below that, so they're down. Unfortunately, when those guys way back when named it, they actually named it upside down, where the base of this triangle is the atria, and the apex is the ventricles. And so this right here is the apex. Now, that's just a unique thing that they did. For me, I really like to look at the heart in terms of the way the blood flows through. It's usually the easiest way to keep track of it. So let's do this. Let's do blood flow. And And so we will start with the right atrium, which is right here. And then that blood flows through. And of course that blue blood is the deoxygenated stuff, right? It's coming back from the rest of your body. It moves from the right atrium into the right ventricle. That blood is then pumped here into the lungs, because take that deoxygenated blood, you put it in the lungs, so then that way oxygen can be added. Now, once it finishes in the lungs, it's been oxygenated, it turns red, right? That's how we always think of things. And so it comes back from the lungs into the left atrium. Now the left atrium then helps that blood flow through, pumps it through into the left ventricle. And once it's finished in the left ventricle, it pumps through, on out, through to the rest of your body, through the aorta and the rest of your arteries. So we've talked about the chambers. Let's talk about the valves that separate them. And this is just a quick review. That way, if we talk about the different valves throughout the lecture, you have been at least reminded of which ones are which. So if we start with the following blood flow, you start in the right atrium. That moves to the right ventricle. Well, the valve that separates them is the tricuspid. And that is this guy right here, is the tricuspid valve. Now, once the blood flows out of the right ventricle, it's going to go into the lungs, and that has its own as well. And so that is the right ventricle, or the pulmonic valve is what separates the right ventricle from the lungs, or the pulmonic artery, pulmonary artery. And that is this one right here. So after blood has gone out through the lungs, gets oxygenated, comes back through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. And so what separates the left atrium from the left ventricle? That is going to be your mitral valve. And then what separates your left ventricle from the aorta? Well, not surprisingly, it's the aortic valve. And that little fella is located right here. And what's really important to note is how all of these valves kind of lie in a group right beside each other. In fact, if you actually look at the heart from the top side down, all four valves are sitting right next to each other, almost like a six-pack of soda, how they had the rings hooking them together. It essentially looks like that. And these are all made of cartilage as well. Deoxygenated blue blood, if you will, venous blood, returning to the heart enters through which part? Well, which half of the heart receives blood from the rest of the body? It's going to be your right sides, correct? So now you just have, because your pulmonary veins and your left atrium are the red blood side of the heart. So between the atrium and ventricle, which one does the blood enter first? It's the atrium, of course. Freshly oxygenated, or red blood, exiting the lungs, enters which chamber of the heart? So if you look at that heart diagram, which chamber receives blood from the lung? Well, the right and left, the right atrium, right ventricle, those are blue blood sides, so those are definitely off. But if you look at your pulmonary veins, which empty out of the lungs, and your left atrium, which is then the next in line, of course, with this question, which chamber of the heart? Left atrium. I realize not everyone does well with pictures and narration, so we have everything written out here as well as a chance for you to go through this entire set of information this way. So you have atrial systole, and systole essentially means squeeze. And with the atria, you're looking at the right atria and the left atria. So both of those squeeze, and what that contraction does is it expels blood into the ventricles, and it's what we also is known as atrial kick. And that atrial kick accounts for 20 to 30% of your cardiac output. So if you think of whatever someone's blood pressure is, without that atrial kick, that will drastically drop their blood pressure by a significant amount. So always keep that in mind, that that atrial systole, that atrial squeeze, is necessary for really good blood pressures. So next, after the atria have squeezed, imagine those completely compressed. Then you have isovolumetric ventricular contraction, which is just a fancy way to say that it squeezes, but no blood moves. And what that pressure does is it actually causes your AV valves, the valves between the atria and ventricles, to close. And that's what makes that fun S1 sound, the lub part of your lub-dub that your heartbeat makes. At a certain point, the ventricles have contracted enough that you will get ventricular ejection. And so what happens is the ventricles, either it's the right ventricle or left ventricle, will push blood to the corresponding areas. And when that happens, the valves that were holding them closed open up. And so a simple way to put this is blood's pushed. After the ventricles have squeezed, they've moved blood to their corresponding aorta or pulmonary artery, the ventricles then relax. And so when the ventricles relax, the blood that they had pushed away winds up flowing back towards it. So this relaxation causes a backflow, essentially. Other things I want to point out, when I say relaxation, that's actually what diastole is. So if systolic is squeeze, diastole is relaxation. When the ventricles relax, that back pressure of the blood coming towards it actually causes your aortic and pulmonary valves to close. And when those close, that makes the dub part of your lub-dub. The way I like to explain backflow is just imagine you had just a pan of water. When you push water, what it does is it flows right back to fill in the void that you had created. Blood doesn't move any differently than water in that regard. So after your ventricles have relaxed, the backflow's happened, it's closed those two valves. What happens now is the valves that were closed between the atria and ventricle open up, and these relaxed ventricles allow passive blood flow to come into them. It's almost essentially as opens up, creates a vacuum, and it actually helps pull that blood in a little bit. And then of course you go back around to atrial, where you get your atrial kick, so on and so forth, and the pattern repeats 60 to 100 times per minute every day of the week, pretty much for your entire life. This one's a little bit trickier because we're using words that you might not be familiar with, but ventricular diastole moves blood into the lungs aorta. Is that true or false? So ventricular, so we're talking about the right ventricle and left ventricle. Diastole is when it is relaxed. So if that ventricle is relaxed, is it moving blood into the lungs and aorta? Of course not. So this question is false. So in talking about the heart, it's important to realize or understand when the heart gets its blood. Now the heart itself is supplied by two main arteries that actually branch directly off of the aorta. So it has that really fresh, super oxygenated blood. what I really want you to know for today is that you've got a right and a left coronary artery, and that they each supply different parts of the heart. Learning the names of all the branches and exactly what chunks of the heart that they feed um, isn't the real focus here. I just want you to have that better understanding so that in the future, um, that's there in the back of your head. Because honestly, even if you don't work in critical care areas, your partner, your parents, your grandparents, and even you may have heart problems in the future. So there's going to be an opportunity for practical application of this. Now, for those that take the 12 lead class, we'll actually dig even deeper and be able to predict what part of the heart is not receiving blood flow based on a 12 lead EKG, which is going to be really, really cool. So more on that in the future for those who do that. So the coronary circulation, how is it laid out? What's going on? So remember, the epicardium, the outside of the heart, is where the arteries and nerves and everything lay, and it feeds in kind of like tree roots. But everything starts right here at the base of the aorta. So that just as blood comes out of the ventricle, it has that first opportunity to work its way back into the heart and feed those muscles. So on this side here, we have the RCA, so right coronary artery, and that's the one here that wraps. And I like this transparent view because you can actually see how it goes around the back side of the heart. And then on the left side of the heart, you have your LCA, and that comes through here, and it actually branches into two separate pieces. It branches into the left circumflex, and then I use a different name for this, where we actually call this one running right down the front here the LDA. Sorry, LAD, left anterior descending artery. One of the questions that tends to come up is why are they called coronary arteries? If you've ever heard of a coronation ceremony where the king or queen gets their crown, well, if you flip the heart upside down, you will realize that the coronary arteries circle around the heart in the same way that a crown would sit on someone's head. Hence the reason, coronary. Just to give you a bit more simplified view of the heart with a little less busy work, you have your RCA here in the front, which actually covers this territory through here. Then you have your, well, that's your LCA, your left coronary artery, but your LAD portion is right in through here. And then you have your LCX move around to the lateral side of the heart. As we flip around to the back side of the heart, where you will see the LCX, it was just a small portion on the anterior, but in reality it actually feeds this entire back portion of the left ventricle. Whereas your RCA has continued wrapping around and feeds the remainder of the right ventricle and the posterior part of the heart. So as part of the advanced arrhythmia class, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into the right and left coronary arteries, and particularly the parts of the heart that they supply, because this is really going to help you with the 12 lead portion coming up later. But I want you to know that the right coronary artery sits on the right side of the heart. In about half of the people, it feeds your SA node, but in 90% of people, it feeds the AV node. So if you have any kind of AV blocks, it's probably the right coronary artery that's been compromised. Of course, it feeds a big chunk of the right ventricle, essentially all of it. But what's really, really cool is this posterior descending artery. And I'm going to flip back to the previous slide so we can look at it. This artery right here is your posterior descending artery. And you'll notice where the left circumflex and the right coronary artery are almost touching. In some individuals, the left circumflex actually comes over and is what feeds this posterior descending. And that's what creates this 85% deal. But for most people, the right coronary artery is connected to the posterior descending artery and feeds the inferior third of the interventricular septum and the posterior wall of the left ventricle. And that's about 85% of people. What makes this really neat is that other 15% then have a left-handed heart instead of a right-handed. It's really just important to know because that means some folks can have a left-sided heart attack that actually affects the right ventricle. And then to continue on with things, of course, the left coronary artery divides into two parts, the left anterior descending and the left circumflex. The LAD will supply the anterior 2/3 of your IV septum. So if you have a MI in your left anterior descending artery, that will not only take out the anterior wall of your left ventricle, but will also affect your IV septum as well. And then your LCX then of course takes care of the lateral wall of the left ventricle, and that remaining group of people that their AV node and their SA node have not been supplied by the right coronary, this is the one that handles all of that. Your inferior posterior left ventricle in 10%, and of course that posterior descending artery, the remainder is there. Which part of the intraventricular septum will be affected by a proximal occlusion of the right coronary artery, the RCA? And so this is just a simple anatomy, blood flow, knowledge check question. You can go back a couple slides and see what's been written there. I even drew it out a little bit, but it's really the question of which part of the heart does it feed? Does it feed the anterior 2/3 of the IV septum? Does it feed the posterior 1/3 of the IV septum? Or is it actually responsible for none of that or all of it? Well, it's pretty much neither one of those, which leaves you with anterior versus posterior. If you recall how the RCA wraps around the right side of the heart and all the way to the back, you'll pretty much be able to right there guess that it is the posterior 1/3 is the correct answer. So where does the venous blood go? Like every other part of your heart, if you bring oxygenated blood in, then the used up blue blood has to go somewhere afterward. Well, in the case of the heart, we have, of course, coronary veins, but what's really cool is you have something called a coronary sinus that it all collects in, and that's here on the back side of the heart. Basically what happens is those veins collect together, and then this dumps into the right atrium. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Take that freshly deoxygenated blood, and what's the shortest route to get it back into the circulation? Well, the right atrium, which then it will flow through with the rest of the blood coming through. Another important thing to mention about this is actually a fairly large opening. Specialty type of pacemakers will actually run the pacemaker through and get to the left side of the heart that way. It's really kind of neat. Just want to make you aware of it. So your entire body is designed around this idea where the most important organs get the most blood flow. So if you think about your brain, that gets almost 20% of every heartbeat goes there, and your kidneys, those are really important too, but your skin and your toes, not so much. Well, the heart's no different. Even on an organ level, the most important parts get the most blood flow. So if you think about your right coronary artery and your left coronary artery, how much area of the heart they feed, that right coronary artery takes care of basically this big old chunk right here, whereas your left anterior descending really only covers this much area. And then, of course, your circumflex covers another chunk over here. And that's really interesting to say that even though the coronary arteries are about the same size, the fact that two major pipelines had to be subdivided in order to cover these areas to give them enough blood flow shows how important that left ventricle is. And then if you really look at it, you can see exactly why if you analyze the muscle mass that's involved with it. So if you look right here, how thick that left ventricle muscle is compared to the right ventricle. And then if you really want to get a good idea, look at how thin this right atrium is compared to the left ventricle. And that just shows you the more muscle there is, the more blood flow they need in order to function right. In fact, that IV septum through here is also a pretty big chunk of muscle, and it has to be fed from the front and the back in order to get the blood flow that it needs. And if you look at your diagram here on the left, this is actually more of how the heart is actually designed, where that left ventricle is kind of the center portion, and that the right ventricle is just kind of attached onto the outside of it, with this being your intraventricular septum here, which is just a really cool design overall to help make sure everything gets squeezed out the way it should be. So a question that comes up then is, when does the heart get its blood flow based on where these arteries are laying? And it's actually a really clever design. If you think about your arm, let's say you try to lift something heavy and you're squeezing your biceps, you can only hold it for so long and eventually you have to put it down. And that's because when your muscles are contracted, no fresh blood flow is going into them, and eventually they just kind of fatigue and give out. Well, the heart is no different. When the heart contracts, blood flow is not actually able to enter, and so it's only during relaxation that blood can flow into the muscles and give them what they need. And so this diagram on the right does a pretty good job of showing it. So during relaxation, and you can see in this picture here where you've got your epicardium, your myocardium, and your endocardium, that when it's relaxed, these vessels are nice and wide, and there's plenty of blood flow able to get all the way down to just to the inside of the heart. Whereas during systole, where you're doing the squeeze, that myocardium has now contracted, including some of that endocardium, and what it has done is narrowed these vessels and pushed all the blood out to this epicardial layer. And that makes sense, right? Squeeze the muscle, pushes the blood out, doesn't allow any fresh blood back in. The reason why this is important is because you need diastole in order for the heart to replenish itself. So if you have a high heart rate, that cuts down on the amount of time, amount of relaxation that occurs, and so it makes it harder for your heart to recharge for the next beat each time. So that's why we like to keep ourselves between 60 and 100. Why we don't like to have ourselves at that maximum heart rate for very long, because your heart will just peter out over time. So keep your heart rates low, keep them controlled, and everything does work quite a bit better. Now for the advanced class, to build upon everything, I want to talk about the exact moment when the heart receives its blood flow, and this is actually really key. If you look over here at the atrium kind of blown up, or the aorta blown up a little bit closer, you'll see that the right and left coronary artery are sitting just inside of the aortic valves. And this is a really cool idea, because during systole, when blood is flowing out, your valves actually fly all the way open and they move to the sides. I'm going to go ahead and use purple. We'll use, and so your blood's flowing out like this, correct? Your oxygenated blood, it's going out through the aorta where it needs to go. Then what happens during diastole, when that ventricle relaxes and you get backflow, where that blood is coming rushing back, your valves actually close like this and prevent any blood from flowing back into the ventricle. So what's really cool about that then is the blood has no choice but to go through your left coronary artery and your right coronary artery. So that during diastole, when the heart is relaxed, that's when the blood is flowing into those coronary arteries. During systole, when the heart is contracting, the valves are closed and it doesn't create a situation where your high pressure created by the ventricle is putting that pressure on your coronary arteries. And so that's where our blood pressures make a big difference, because you want your patients to have, that classic, well, let's just say 110/70. Well, 110 is your ventricle contracting, enough pressure to reach the entirety of your body. Well, that 70 is what your coronary arteries are getting in terms of their blood pressure. So it's important that we keep this diastolic blood pressure in a reasonable range, because otherwise you wind up with too much pressure on your coronary arteries, and that can create troubles in and of themselves. So just to recap really quickly, why is all of this so important? Well, knowing which artery supplies which area of the heart can help you understand where the problems are at. If they're having a specific repetitive arrhythmia, that may be a hint of which artery is compromised. Or if you're looking in terms of an MI or something along that line, if they have a blockage, that's going to help out not only the cath lab on which artery they need to fix, but also tell you exactly how dangerous or what treatment modalities you may need to apply in order to help your patient. How to really figure all of that stuff out is going to be in the 12-lead course. But remember, this can happen to anyone. Blood flow through the myocardium, the muscle, occurs during which portion of the cardiac cycle? In this case, you have to think back. When does the muscle receive its blood? It's not during any kind of systole, so we can take that off. Isovolumetric ventricular contraction, that's also a type of systole, so that's not going to count. So then you're now at ejection and diastole. Well, in order to achieve ventricular ejection, you have to be squeezing during that time. So that automatically takes that off the table too, which leaves you with ventricular diastole. When that muscle is relaxed, that's when blood can flow into it and oxygenate the muscle. As detailed in the lecture, diastolic hypertension is of particular concern for which portion of the heart? And the big key here is diastolic hypertension. I specifically talked about how that high continuous blood pressure affects a certain part of the heart. And right away, you can tell that your SA node and your bundle branches, those are part of the electrical conduction system. So blood pressure doesn't really affect those. Your tricuspid valve, potentially, but that tricuspid's on the right side of your heart, so that's really not going to be the problem either. It ultimately comes down to these coronary arteries. That's what's going to be affected by that high continuous resting or relaxed blood pressure, because that's really bad for you, cause coronary artery disease and part of that whole mess.